Welcome, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here for today's Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly pretty sobering analytical framework. It's from financial expert James Rickards, specifically looking at his book, The Big Drop: How to Grow Your Wealth During the Coming Collapse. Now, our goal today is to impartially break down his central thesis, which is that the global financial system is basically teetering on the edge of a major structural collapse. But more importantly, we're going to look at the historical data and the economic models he uses to back this whole thing up. Look, whether you agree with his conclusions or not, the economic dynamics he explores here are absolutely worth understanding. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for Rickards' analysis today. We'll cover the elite warning signs, the new depression, inflation versus deflation, 5 crisis triggers, and finally, a wealth preservation playbook. Section 1. The elite warning signs. You know, there's this old saying on Wall Street that nobody rings a bell at the top of a market to warn you to get out. But Rickards believes that global financial elites actually do ring a bell. They just only ring it for each other. To see what he means, consider this tiny 100-day window back in 2014. In June, the Bank for International Settlements, which is essentially the central bank for central bankers, warned that markets had become euphoric. By September, G20 finance ministers were flagging a buildup of excessive risk. Just a few days later, a highly connected Geneva think tank warned of record-breaking global debt. And then in October, the IMF literally warned that capital markets were vulnerable to financial Ebolas. The author frames these highly technical reports as a sort of insider bell, sounded right before the Dow Jones took a sudden 700-point nosedive. The elites, he suggests, signal each other to move to safe assets way before the everyday investor even knows what hit them. Section 2. The New Depression. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Rickards' premise that we've actually been living in a global structural depression since 2007, but it's been masked by central bank money printing. When we hear the word depression, we immediately picture the 1930s, right? We think of breadlines, crashing GDP, massive unemployment. But we can point back to the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who defined a depression simply as a chronic condition of subnormal activity without a tendency toward recovery or complete collapse. So it doesn't necessarily mean negative growth. It just means persistent below-trend growth. Let's look at the numbers, because the historical data backs this up perfectly. The normal growth trend for the U.S. economy is usually right around 3%. During boom years like the mid-1980s under Reagan, it spiked over 5.5%. But following the 2008 crisis, growth averaged a measly 1%. Now, the difference between 3% and 1% growth over long periods of time, that completely destroys wealth. And because this is a structural issue, meaning it requires actual changes in tax policy or regulation to fix, the cyclical tools used by the Federal Reserve, like printing money or lowering interest rates, simply cannot fix it. And this structural weakness is also threatening the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. History shows us that currencies don't just lose their status overnight. It's a slow slippage. Take the British sterling, for example. Starting with the financial panic of 1914, gold began flowing to the U.S. By 1939, the UK had to suspend gold shipments. It took 30 years before the dollar officially took over at Bretton Woods in 1944. Today, Rickards warns we are seeing the exact same stealthy decline. The U.S. dollar is slowly slipping while countries like China covertly amass thousands of tons of gold, setting the stage for a new creditor power. Section 3. Inflation versus deflation. So, what exactly are central banks doing about this mess? Rickards brilliantly compares our current economy to the San Andreas Fault. We basically have two massive tectonic plates grinding against each other. On one side, you have deflation. In a depression, deflation is the natural dynamic. People pay down debt, sell assets, and prices naturally fall. Now, this is great if you're holding cash, but it's absolutely terrible for debtors and governments. On the other side of the fault line, you have inflation, which is artificially forced by central banks continuously printing money. They want inflation because it helps debtors pay off their obligations with cheaper, debased money. These two massive plates are locked in a super dangerous tug of war, and eventually, one of them is going to snap. Now, you might be wondering, why do central banks prefer the inflation side of the fault line? It comes down to a concept called the money illusion. Think about it. If the government simply confiscated money straight from your bank account to pay off someone else's bad mortgage, there would be riots in the streets. But if the central bank quietly engineers 3% inflation, they achieve the exact same transfer of wealth. Your savings lose their real purchasing power, while the debtor's burden shrinks. When you see your paycheck go up slightly, you might feel pretty good, but this ignores the hidden tax of inflation that is secretly draining your actual wealth every time you go to the grocery store. And this brilliantly illustrates a related concept called the Cantillon effect. Inflation doesn't just hit everyone at exactly the same time. It moves outward, kind of like ripples in a pond. The wealthy, connected insiders are sitting right in the center. They see the inflation coming and use the newly printed money to buy up hard assets early on. By the time that inflation ripples out to the outer rings, to everyday middle-class savers, prices have completely skyrocketed, and their purchasing power is already destroyed. Section 4. 5 Triggers for Collapse. So what actually sparks the crash? Rickards outlines specific catalysts that could finally snap that economic San Andreas fault we talked about. He identifies 5 distinct threat scenarios. First, an enemy hedge fund attack, where a sovereign power like China or Russia uses their massive reserves to intentionally crash U.S. markets. Second, a sudden behavioral shift by consumers that sparks runaway hyperinflation. Third, central banks simply losing the tug-of-war, resulting in a destructive deflationary spiral. Fourth, an unpredictable geopolitical crisis, like a sudden war or energy shock. And fifth, a sudden market collapse driven by the sheer weight of concentrated, over-leveraged banking assets. Now, you might think a system collapse would require some earth-shattering event. Actually, scratch that. Rickards uses the metaphor of the snowflake and the avalanche. Imagine a snowpack building up on a mountainside, getting heavier, more unstable day by day. It doesn't take dynamite to start the avalanche. A single, perfectly ordinary snowflake, landing in just the wrong way on a bad day, can trigger a catastrophic cascade. The trigger itself doesn't have to be massive at all, so long as the system is already inherently unstable. Let's move to and see how this builds, because historically, we've almost gone over the edge twice in recent memory. Back in 1998, the collapse of long-term capital management brought the global system within hours of failure until Wall Street stepped in and bailed it out. Then in 2008, the Lehman and AIG crashes froze the system until the Fed dropped a steel curtain to stop the dominoes. But Rickards proposes a frightening argument. It's 3 strikes and you're out. The Federal Reserve has bloated its balance sheet to $4 trillion fighting the last crisis. When the next drop happens, he argues, the Fed will literally have no dry powder left to bail us out. Section 5. The Wealth Preservation Playbook. Okay, so if the system is really this fragile, how do we protect ourselves? You don't have to be a victim here, provided you prepare ahead of time. To figure out how, Rickards looks at the ultimate insiders. Take 1923. A German industrialist named Hugo Stinnes became the richest man in his country by doing something very specific. He borrowed money to buy hard assets, coal, shipping, and gold, right before the Weimar hyperinflation hit. His debts were completely wiped out, and his hard assets exploded in value. Fast forward to today, and Warren Buffett is running a very similar playbook. Buffett has been buying up hard assets like railroads and oil while simultaneously hoarding billions of dollars in cash. Smart money is actively sidestepping currency collapse. So the crucial point is how you actually construct your own portfolio in response to all this uncertainty. The recommendation here is what's called a barbell portfolio. Remember that tug of war between inflation and deflation? Because you don't know which side will snap first, you prepare for both. You hold hard assets like gold, fine art, and land on one side to protect against hyperinflation. And on the other side, you hold cash and high-quality bonds to protect against deflation. This balance takes the volatility out of your portfolio and gives you the optionality to pivot when the crisis finally hits. It's a truly fascinating framework, isn't it? It forces us to look past the daily news headlines and examine the structural foundations of our money. We've covered the hidden warning signs, the invisible depression, the money illusion, those unpredictable triggers, and finally, the playbook to survive it. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. When the tectonic plates of the global economy finally shift, will you be caught in the illusion or prepared with the playbook? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious, stay informed, and I highly encourage you to consider how these massive macro forces might just impact your own savings. See you next time.